Well, welcome, Andrew Kilpatrick, someone I worked with many years ago in the Treasury. I wonder if just to start off with, Andrew, you could tell us a little bit about yourself as an economist, where you trained and where you worked.
Well, Andrew, it's nice to talk to you after such a long time.
Thank you.
I started my economics career, of course, at school, like many of your students, and then went to Cambridge and studied at Trinity College, where I did an undergraduate degree. And then I stayed on to do research and was lucky enough to have a research fellowship at Sydney Sussex College, Cambridge, a little after that. So I spent quite a lot of time in Cambridge, which was a very pleasant place, before moving back to London, which is where I started.
And did you spend your entire professional career at the Treasury, other than going to the EBRD, which we'll talk about in a minute?
No, I started, well, apart from doing research in Cambridge at the beginning, I then moved to London to an organisation that was a sort of combination between the civil service and the Employers Association and the trade unions. It was a tripartite organisation, which existed in those days long ago. And then after that, I moved to the city briefly, which wasn't a particularly happy period. It was not quite what I had expected. And I moved then to the Treasury, which was more to my liking, if you like. And then after that, a long time after that, I moved to the EBRD.
Okay, well, let's tackle some of those. So can you tell us some of the interesting problems that you've had to tackle in your economics career?
Yes, I mean, I'll think of a couple of examples here, which are probably not the most obvious. Well, one may be more obvious than the other. The first was when I left university and I went, as I was just explaining, to this organisation in London, which is a tripartite organisation, and that was in the early 1980s. And I don't suppose you remember, and certainly your students won't, but one of the things that was going on, of course, was the Thatcher Revolution, and part of that at the beginning was very, very, very serious, and it resulted in a huge increase in unemployment. And at the time when I started, unemployment was something close to, I think, around 4 million. Very, very high indeed, over 10% of the working population. And one of the issues, of course, at the time was how do you deal with this situation? How do you improve the jobs market? Well, I was working in the Millbank Tower, and that it was essentially a tall building in London by the river, and the action all took place on the sort of 18th floor, 15th to 18th floors. So it had a very good view of the whole of London. It was a very pleasant working environment. And the way this worked was that the Chancellor would chair a meeting once a month, and it would be a meeting which involved the Employers Association and the head of the trade unions and various other interested parties. And it was all about, the economic situation. And I remember distinctly one occasion, the head of the trade unions, I used to sit in on these meetings, he addressed the Chancellor saying, well, look, unemployment is 4 million people. Look out here, look out of the window. Where are we going to find the new jobs? Where are the new jobs going to come from? And there was pretty much a stony silence because nobody really had a very good idea how jobs were going to be created on that scale in order to solve this pressing problem at the time, which wasn't just an economic one, it was a social one. There were riots, there was, deprivation for a lot of people. It was really very, very difficult. Now, I wasn't, of course, somebody who could do much about it directly, but I remember working with my colleagues and we looked into some of the issues and we focused very much on productivity. I did a bit of work on industrial policy and on education policy at the time. And the truth was that there wasn't an immediate answer. And indeed, unemployment remained high for a while. But the answers seemed to be more in the longer term and in productivity. And we focused on that. And the government indeed, said quite a lot about that, the supply side revolution, some people describe it as. And although at the time nobody could imagine how 4 million jobs could be created, they were. And it was relatively soon that unemployment fell sharply and a lot of good things happened after that. So I think one of the lessons from that is to sort of at least think through to the longer term and to try to focus on the sort of core underlying issues. And this was the case of productivity, was something that Britain was poor at and had to do better at. I'm sorry to say that the world comes around again. I mean, we've got unemployment right now rising sharply. We've got a very poor productivity record in Britain just recently. So some of these issues are all too prevalent today. That was one thing I was thinking of, but there was a rather different one experience that I had in a completely different context, which was at the Treasury sometime later. And that was when the UK had become an occupying power in Iraq.
On which we worked on together. Yep.
You will remember this.
I do.
You were there at the time, I think, Andrew. And one of the factors in this situation was under UN law, an occupying power has to take some responsibility for the economy of the country that it's involved in. And so that meant essentially the US and the UK had to consider the economic situation. Now, I won't go into a lot of detail. There's a huge number of things involved in all of that. But there was one particular episode that I was involved in, which was really, truly extraordinary. It was somebody who was trained as an economist, who spent time in academia, who had been at the Treasury, who was doing macro. And that was about the currency, not the sort of thing one normally thinks about day to day, but it was, what do we do with this currency? The reason there was a problem was because there had been sanctions on Iraq for some time, for other reasons, and new currency hadn't been able to be circulated. So they had no access to new notes. And so the old notes were circulating round and round and round. It was known as the Saddam dinar. And probably people don't know much about this, but actually notes wear out pretty quickly. New style plastic notes are very different, but the old style ones, run out pretty quickly after use. And so they've been running with these very old notes, and indeed even to the extent that the Saddam regime had been photocopying currency and using that as currency. It was completely bizarre. So it had to be changed. You couldn't run a country like this. And there was very high inflation. So we had this conundrum of what do we do? Well, the first thing was relatively easy, and that was to set up a tender for a new production of a note that's secure and fraud-proof and so on. That we arranged, and De La Rue, a printer in the UK at the time, won the contract. So they were commissioned to print new money for this country. The idea being that they would swap the old notes for the new notes. Now, one thing I never thought about, and I don't suppose you or obviously many others have, is when you think about notes, and you may think about the notes in your pocket, and you think, well, there's some notes in my pocket. Now, they don't weigh very much, do they? But when you want billions of dollars of equivalent Iraqi notes in small denominations, they weigh hundreds of tons. So the next problem was, how do we get all this currency into the country? And the situation on the ground was terrible. There was a civil war going on. There was terrorist attacks every day. No civil airliner would fly into Baghdad or anywhere else in Iraq. So my colleague somehow managed to commission probably a somewhat dodgy Nigerian airline to be prepared to fly in the notes from wherever they were printed. I forget where now. It might have been Malta or somewhere strange. And they were commissioned to go and fly it in, and then they did. And so they got the notes in, and then there was a whole question of how do you swap the notes and how do you distribute them across the whole country. So without going into detail of that, I mean, the problem for me was quite a unique one for an economist, not usually thinking about the practicalities of, yes, we talk about money, but, how often do you talk about notes, and how often do you realize that actually swapping notes and getting them into a country is pretty difficult. But then, I wasn't at the Bank of England. They probably thought about it then more than I did.
Well, I remember the incident very clearly, and I remember a couple of things about it. First of all, that suddenly parts of the Treasury that no one had taken much notice of for years became suddenly quite fashionable. So people involved in payroll and things like that, public sector pay. And the second is that we worked on that, of course, with Andrew Bailey, who's now gone on to be the governor of the Bank of England. I remember him telling me the 10 features, security features of a UK banknote that we needed to replicate in Iraq, which I'm sure was done successfully. So I'm going to take you back now to 1997, which is the year that I joined the Treasury, when there'd been a major change of government. Tony Blair had come in, and a massive change of emphasis. And you at the time were leading the fiscal and monetary policy team. And it must have been a bit of a crazy time as a new fiscal and monetary regime was set up. Those listeners may not realise that was the independence of the Bank of England and some new fiscal rules. So can you tell us a bit about that, what was done and what the challenges were?
Yes, I mean, that was one of the more extraordinary moments in my career. And I have to say, as an economist, it couldn't have been a more interesting or challenging task in front of me. I mean, okay, I've spent 40 years in the business or whatever it is doing economics, one sort or another, and it's only occasionally you come up with something that you think about in textbook terms initially, and then you suddenly realize, well, here it is. You've got to do something. So the background was, as you point out, there was a change of government. The Tony Blair regime came in 1997, and I remember distinctly. You may remember too that when a lot of people will have seen the clapping in Downing Street when Tony Blair himself arrived at number 10. But what people haven't seen probably is the clapping that went on when Gordon Brown and his team came into the Treasury that day, I guess May, I've forgotten now, of 1997. And what I didn't know, because I wasn't that important, but I heard about subsequently, was when Gordon Brown and Ed Balls, who was his chief economic advisor at the time, turned up at the Treasury. They acknowledged all the applause and were very happy to receive it. They went straight to the permanent secretary's office, who at the time was Terry Burns, a very pleasant and strong economist, actually, and they turned up in his office. Normally in these situations, the permanent secretary of a ministry like Treasury says, good morning or good afternoon, Minister Chancellor, very pleased to see you here. We've been thinking about what you might need for your arrival, and here's a set of documents for you to read over the weekend and think about what you might want to do. Normally these things started with the exchange rate and, what you do in an emergency and so on and so forth. Well, the story is that Gordon Brown received this tall, stack of documents and said, thank you, Terry, pushed it to one side and said, with an envelope he had in his hand, said, this is what I want you to do. I'd like you to sort this out over the weekend. So the tables were turned and Terry Burns opened the envelope, and what it said was, we want a new macroeconomic regime. We want a new fiscal policy. We want a new monetary policy. And the first step is to create an independent central bank, make the Bank of England independent. But as you can imagine, that sent some shockwaves around the building. Not that anybody didn't want to do it. It was just, this wasn't how normal practice went on. And it was very quickly, because I was heading the fiscal and monetary policy, macroeconomic policy group, as you know, came down to me saying, we've got to create something that works for the new government, and it's going to involve an independent central bank. So that was a nice thing in principle, but the real question is exactly how do you do it? And so we got thinking about that. We devised the Monetary Policy Committee, this MPC. Key to that was to ensure that there was a good balance of independent experts, not simply a bunch of Bank of England officials. So that was very important. Another aspect that was important was to have a Treasury representative on the committee, not a voting member, but a representative who could speak and participate. And the reason for that thinking was to make sure there was proper coordination between monetary and fiscal policy. That's essential in a country. And it's one of the big questions that still is there about the European Union or the Euro area, where fiscal and monetary policy are not so well connected, one might say. So that was some of the things that we started to think about and how to implement it. The other aspect was to create a letter system whereby the governor of the Bank of England would have to write to the Chancellor should they be missing their goals. Critically important too was the allocation of responsibilities to the different parties. So here, as I'm sure you and others know, the idea was to set an inflation target, which was the goal of the policy, which was done by the government, essentially the Treasury, allowing the Bank of England through the MPC to set interest rates in order to meet that target. And that was the basic system. And if they failed, the governor would have to explain. The sting in the tail for the governor of the Bank of England at the time, who was Eddie George, who's no longer with us, unfortunately, but he was told a little later that financial supervision would be taken away from the Bank of England and handed to a new body. And, as I was mentioning earlier, often things go round in circles. It's come back to the Bank of England subsequently after a series of crises, but at the time it was moved away. But that also left fiscal policy. So what was going to be done there? And the answer on that was to increase transparency quite considerably. It had been an opaque area. it had been very much the whim of chancellors to decide, before their budget speech what they were going to do. There was budget murder, this idea of complete secrecy until the moment the chancellor was at the dispatch box in the House of Commons, and so on and so forth. So what we decided, and we were helped in this, I must say, by colleagues from Australia and New Zealand who had been thinking a bit about this and done similar things in their own countries a little earlier. We decided to legislate for fiscal framework for every government in the future now or then and in the future was required to have a fiscal framework and publicize its fiscal rules, the way in which it was going to operate policy. And within that, the fiscal rules were changed in a way that was very important. The two aspects were, first of all, to separate cyclical effects from structural effects. So I know this may sound a bit technical to some people, but when unemployment rises and taxes fall, there's an inevitable increase in the fiscal deficit or a reduction in the surplus. And similarly, when there's a boom, taxes come rolling in, unemployment drops, and there's a huge increase in potential surplus or a reduction in deficit. And these things go up and down over the course of the cycle. So we wanted to abstract from that and focus policy on the structural element, which is the thing that really mattered in the end. And that was the focus of policy. That was one important change from the past. Another thing was to be more clear about the reporting of information in relation to fiscal policy. So these elements were quite important in getting a new regime in place. And I think it was pretty successful. There was a change. The rule also, I should have mentioned, was called the Golden Rule. It focused on the current budget to be in balance, if you like, over the cycle rather than the whole budget. And this was very logical, and it's still surprising that it hasn't fully come back again, because there were various changes along the way, simply because if you were a commercial business, you think about your capital budget and current budget separately. I mean, they're dealt with, you borrow to invest, and you make sure you can pay your bills as they come through day by day. And, there's a lesson there maybe for today, given the situation we're facing and the need in the future for more investment. But anyway, these things were changed, and that was pretty extraordinary. So we had to act fast. And, maybe I can tell you a bit about the lessons that I, drew from that episode and the challenges we faced, because they were pretty serious. You had a new chancellor, a new government, espousing new views on economic policy. Every journalist in town was interested in finding out more, creating a name for themselves. Kudos for the great splash headline. Every opposition member was looking for faults to say, it's not going to work. It's wrong. So we were under a lot of pressure.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you a question a bit later about the fiscal monetary framework in relation to the current crisis, but we'll hold fire on that one. But it is extraordinary that, in essence, it's the same one nearly a quarter of a century later, with some adjustments to fiscal rules. Let's come on to the time when you and I worked together in the country economics and policy team in the Treasury, and we advised the Chancellor on the UK's response to various international economic crises. Now, some of these never made the headlines in the way that the current one does. So you and I worked a lot on Turkey, which kept us up late at night, but don't think it kept that many people up late at night. And we worked on Iraq, that you've currently mentioned. Just tell me, if we had to narrow it down to one thing you learnt about how to handle economic crises, what would be the key thing?
Well, that's a good question. I think the first thing, there have been many crises since. There were many before, and no doubt many in the future to come. So I think the first thing is absolutely stay cool. Don't panic, as the phrase goes. Don't be too hasty. Think it through and think for the longer term. Because although at the time it seems, disastrous, everything's going to be falling apart. It's we can't go on, this sort of thing. The truth is that many crises give opportunities for change. and they allow things to be put in place, sometimes quickly, that would otherwise take years to happen, or maybe even never happen at all. So my thinking is that, stay calm and try and think it through. Collect the right people around you. If you're managing a team like I was at the time, make sure you've got the right people who've got the right skills, and brainstorm on ideas that might work. Coordinate with all the key actors and stakeholders involved, both here and abroad, because in the case of Turkey, it was very clear we had to obviously deal with people in Turkey. In the case of Iraq, it was very clear, again, we had to work with the US and the IMF and so on and so forth. So you will coordinate all these things and develop a plan and think how it can be implemented. Those are the key things. I think so. It's very much about taking an opportunity. The other thing I would say, which is true in relation to the previous discussion about the fiscal monetary regime, is that be ready for the unexpected. Prepare for the unexpected. This is pretty important. So you can, as an economist, do a lot of thinking in advance about what the right system might look like in the future. Often the political context makes it very difficult to make changes, and then suddenly there's a crisis, and every politician is looking at the officials or others to say, what do we do? Help me. And if you've got a plan that you've been thinking about before, that's your opportunity. So I think it's extremely important to spend time thinking about ideas, coming up with potential solutions that may not be appropriate that day, but you'll find one day that they do come up and they are appropriate and you can implement them. And that's the opportunity you can take.
Well, I remember spending most of the summer of 2002 trying to anticipate what might happen in Iraq. And I think that time was well spent. Equally, you were saying about the opportunity that crisis brings. I think when you were arriving in CEP, that was the time when thinking about exchange rate systems was changing because of the Asia crisis and the Russia crisis, and the fact that no exchange rate peg in the world seemed to be defensible. And we talk a lot now in class about just how difficult it is to defend a fixed exchange rate system. I think that orthodoxy was established around that time due to crises, really, wasn't it? Okay, now I could ask you an awful lot about your more recent job, about the EBRD, but could I just ask you one thing on this, which is most students won't know about the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. They might confuse it with the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, i.e. the World Bank. Yeah. But can you tell us what it does, and tell us one thing you've seen it do effectively?
Yes, of course. And it's not exactly a coincidence that it has a name that's very similar to the IBRD, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, because indeed that's how it, in a way, the name came about. So the EBRD is a regional, what's called a regional MDB, a regional multilateral development bank. Essentially, it's a regional World Bank. And it came about after the fall of the Berlin Wall, when the Cold War ended in the early 1990s. And it was focused on Central and Eastern Europe. So the idea of the bank in its origin was to help support the transformation of former communist countries, former socialist countries, towards market democracies, if you like. That was the background. And it was given some capital. It was owned at the time by over 40 shareholders or thereabouts, who were essentially governments from around the world, from wherever it be, from the UK, the US, Japan, Korea, and so forth, and indeed including the countries that the operations were going to take place in, which at the time included the Soviet Union. It hadn't collapsed when it started, but also Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia as was. So a lot of things have happened in the 30 years or so since it got going. And the idea of these banks is essentially to use public capital, which can be then deployed to invest in these countries and help support the changes that need to come about. The focus of the EBRD has always been about supporting the private sector primarily. So the idea was to use its capital and work with Western investors, but also local investors who are in the private sector, to try to build a system that was more robust, let's say, than the one that they'd been used to under communist rule. So there are many examples of types of investments. I mean, every sector more or less you can think of is part of the bank's business, other than defense and health and some of these more sensitive public areas. So it invests in many things, and indeed, in banks to on-lend to small businesses, for example. A lot of work on privatizations. In terms of an example of what sort of business has been done that I've been involved in, there are many projects, and I suppose one example, nothing specific, but a more general thing, to illustrate the type of work that goes on, which ranges from the big, corporates, big privatizations through to the small things, is in the municipal sector, so-called, i.e., more local activity. Now, it's not only a bank that supports local businesses, it's also supported local administrations and municipalities. So one of the examples of the work the bank does is, for instance, to support investment in new green trolley buses, let's say, in small cities in Ukraine or in Georgia or even further afield. And the way this has worked is to provide an opportunity for the municipality and the utilities that support the local needs of the population, whether it be for district heating or for wastewater treatment plants, or in this case for urban transport, to allow them to perform more efficiently and more economically successfully in order to make the whole system run better, such as the public transport system. So the bank would invest in buying new trolley buses for the municipality, let's say, because they can't afford to do it themselves. The regime between the fiscal regime between the centre and the municipal system is often not very flexible or working very well. And then introduce Western support ideas such as better accounting, such as better route planning into their municipalities to help them make it all work better, with the idea of building up a system where the user pays more than just relying on the state for a subsidy to make it all happen. So there are many examples like that of where you've got some real investment on the ground, buses, such like, and a better system put in place to make it work, so that the bank can withdraw and say, you can do it on your own now.
Because we spend quite a lot of time in microeconomics talking about different structures, and that's a great example of a more market-oriented system being supported, having been a command economy, and producing better incentives for resources to be allocated. Okay, now I have two final questions for you, Andrew, and they're both about applying what you've previously said to current problems. So the first question is about coronavirus, of course, and it's about the fiscal and monetary framework. The question is, what do you think the challenges are for the UK fiscal and monetary policy from the current crisis? And is there one thing you think policymakers should bear in mind as they make decisions on this?
Well, that's a big question, as you know. I'm certainly no expert on the COVID-19 disease and its transmission, the testing regime that needs to be put in place, the vaccine that might or might not be available. So clearly, the big problem facing everybody at the moment is the uncertainty, the lack of knowledge when we can say this is going to stop, and therefore, that feeds back into the whole system, as we know, including, whether we can go out and about after this weekend or not, and if so, how. But it comes back to the question of the fiscal and macro response to the crisis. I mean, as everybody knows, there's been an immediate response, but the big question is how long can it go on before really, we're bankrupt, or not really bankrupt, but before we really start. What's very interesting and very difficult about this situation, in my view, is that we've been hit by a multifaceted shock, if you like. It's a demand shock, it's a supply shock, and it's a structural shock all in one. Normally, we don't see this type of thing. I mean, the global financial crisis 10 years, 12 years ago was a big shock, of course, of its own kind to the banking system, to the financial system. And it was possible to recover from that by, a lot of increase in capital in the banks to restabilize the situation. Right now, it's very difficult to know what to do. On the one hand, the normal response to a demand shock is to use the levers of fiscal and monetary policy, whether that means lower interest rates or lower taxes or more public spending and to boost demand. But if people are stuck at home, unable to go out and buy things, you can't boost demand very easily. On the supply side, it's always much harder. And there, as I indicated right at the beginning, you need to think about productivity improvements and solutions of that kind, often to the normal kind of situation of supply shocks. Often there's no way out of a supply shock. We've seen that many times from oil price shocks in around the world. You have to adjust, and you do so slowly. But in this situation, this shock is very, very difficult. What I think has been helpful is to try to find ways to link some of the bits of the supply chain through providing loan guarantees and loan opportunities for businesses to keep going and try and take them through the crisis and hope that the crisis is not so long that it is impossible for them to work in the longer run. So keeping the supply chains moving and therefore productivity sort of not falling through the floor is important, and the lending regime that the government has put in place, I think, that does help on that. As to the structural shock and what you do on that score, it's not something you can do much about, but you have to think about what it might mean in the longer term. And here I think some big questions arise over automation, artificial intelligence, all of which will be hugely increased potentially as a result of this crisis, I think. You have to think about structural changes, lifestyle changes. People may well be wondering, why have they spent their time commuting every day for the last many years and wasting all that time and feeling frustrated. That could be a big structural change. Shopping, as we know, has moved online. It could continue to go in that direction. All these things are hugely difficult to know the answers to. And what I hope is that a lot of people start putting their thinking caps on and coming up with ideas, including people listening to this who may well have ideas that are a bit off the wall, let's say, but actually they may be just the answer to it. I've kind of speculated a bit that I don't play computer games. Maybe you do, but my children have done. And what's odd there is you look at one of these games and you can find virtual realities where people can happily shop and manage their finances, in this unreal world somehow or other. So there's sort of systems that work in a virtual reality that we're now having to face almost in a way in the real world. So there may be some solutions, wacky ones or not, out there to help get us through this situation.
So thinking outside the box, and very much going back to your earlier theme of looking for opportunity within a crisis. Okay, Andrew, final question then, and it's not an easy one. The last crisis that we saw, you can argue that there was an effective global coordinated response. Any prospect of that, and what would be the key element, do you think?
Yes, yes, I should answer. That is tremendously important. It was a key element in the response in 2008. As everybody knows, I think Gordon Brown, our Chancellor at the time, was very instrumental in acting fast and getting people together. And he had a lot of clout. He was well respected, both as an intellectual, but also as a man who could try to get things moving at the time. And there was a lot done as a result of that through international coordination. Presently, the international coordination has been weak in terms of leadership. I think that's very clear. Conflicting views from the US about even within the US what the right answer is, let alone across the US, and coordination with China and so on is difficult there. In the UK's case, we've been very focused on the Brexit issue for a long time, haven't really been coordinating effectively across the globe, perhaps as we might. And this has come on, a huge shock to the system. What I can say that is encouraging, though, at least at some level, is that on the world of EBRD, the multilateral development banks, the international organizations that have money to deploy in the situation, especially the World Bank and the IMF, but also other regional development banks, the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank, and so on. There is coordination going on there, very, very strong coordination, actively every day, to try to make sure that the poorer countries of the world, some of which haven't been fully hit by this disease yet, will be in a better position to respond when they face it, or indeed to be able to respond in the situation they're already facing.
Okay, so almost a mirror image of 2008 then, the international financial institutions leading the way and perhaps setting an example that governments might follow. Okay, thank you ever so much, Andrew. That was brilliant. And I think we've only scratched the surface of your expertise there. Thank you ever so much. A very full career being brought into the discussion there. We'll leave it there for today. Thank you ever so much.